Somewhere in your closet right now is a jacket you have not worn in 2 years. You will not throw it out. You tell yourself you might need it someday, when it finally gets cold enough. That instinct feels small and a little irrational. It is not small. It might be one of the oldest habits your species has. Because here is the strange part. You are, biologically speaking, a naked ape. No food. No seat coat. Your ancestors lost almost all their body hair somewhere over 1 million years ago, and researchers like Nina Jablonski have spent years studying why. The leading explanation is heat, not cold. Early humans in Africa were long-distance hunters, chasing prey across open, sun-baked ground for hours at a time, and bare skin let them sweat and dump heat fast enough to keep running. A body covered in thick fur would have overheated and collapsed. So evolution solved one problem and quietly created another. You inherited a body built to survive brutal heat. Then, at some point, your ancestors started walking north into places that had almost none of that heat left. Picture it for a second. Somewhere around 100,000 years ago, give or take, a small group of humans is standing at the edge of a landscape that looks nothing like home. Cold wind, frozen ground, animals with thick winter coats walking past like it cost them nothing. And these humans are carrying skin that evolved for a savanna, not for a place where your breath turns to fog. You'd think the fix is obvious. Kill an animal, drape the hide over your shoulders, problem solved. Case closed. Next question. Except that is not actually the moment that saved them. Meant scientists had to study something you would never guess in 100 tries. Yes, lice. Head lice have been living on human scalps for millions of years, quietly evolving right along with us the entire time. But there's a second kind, one that lives in clothing instead of hair. In 2003, researcher Ralph Kittler, working with Mark Stoneking, compared the DNA of both kinds of lice. Clothing lice needed a completely new habitat to survive in the first place. That means the moment humans started wearing clothes regularly, that population of lice split off and began evolving on its own separate genetic timeline. By measuring how much clothing lice DNA had drifted from head lice DNA, the researchers could estimate roughly when that split happened. Their answer, somewhere around 170,000 years ago. Not 60,000, not 1,000,000, 170,000 years, hiding inside the genes of bugs almost nobody wants to think about, let alone study on purpose. And that number opens up a much stranger question than when did humans start wearing clothes? It opens up this one. Why did it take so long? Modern humans, or something very close to us, had already existed for tens of thousands of years by that point. Ice ages had already come and gone more than once. Cold was not new information to the species. So, if wrapping yourself in a dead animal skin is such an obvious move, why does the genetic evidence suggest it wasn't happening consistently until so much later than you'd expect? This is where the obvious answer starts to fall apart. Draping a raw hide over your shoulders does help a little near your torso, but it is nowhere near as effective as it sounds, especially once temperatures drop far below freezing for months on end. Loose hide slips. It gaps open at the neck, the wrists, the ankles, exactly where your body loses heat the fastest. A caveman movie version of coat is better than standing there naked. It is not enough to reliably survive a real ice age winter, year after year, generation after generation. So what actually changed? This is where archaeologist Ian Gilligan's research becomes the real hinge point of the story. Gilligan has spent years studying the difference between simple draped clothing and what he calls tailored clothing, meaning garments that are cut and stitched to actually fit the shape of a human body. And the physical evidence for that shift shows up in a strangely small object, needles. Not needles like the ones in a modern sewing kit, obviously. Tiny needles carved from bone, with a hole punched through one end for thread, made from sinew or plant fiber. One of the oldest known examples was found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, dated to roughly 50,000 years ago. That is not a coincidental detail. Fitted, sewn clothing traps a thin layer of warm air directly against your skin and holds it there. Loose hide cannot do that. Sewn clothing can. And that difference is not small when you're trying to survive a Siberian winter with a body that spent a million years evolving for African heat instead. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Homo sapiens were not the only humans living through these ice ages. Neanderthals had already been in cold Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, stockier, heavier, better at conserving heat. On paper, they had the advantage. They should have owned the cold. But there is growing evidence that Neanderthals mostly relied on simple draped hides rather than fitted, sewn garments. Homo sapiens, arriving later with bone needles and tailored clothing, effectively brought better technology to a fight that biology alone was already losing. Researchers still debate exactly how much weight this factor carried, but it's taken seriously as one piece of a much larger puzzle explaining why Homo sapiens expanded across Ice Age Eurasia, while Neanderthal populations eventually disappeared. Let that sit for a second. Clothing might be one of the oldest examples in human history of technology quietly winning a fight that biology alone could not. There's one more twist hiding in that same lice research, and it's worth pausing on. Body lice aren't just an inconvenience. They're a disease vector capable of spreading illnesses like typhus between people living in close contact, which means the invention that let humans survive the cold also created a brand new way for disease to travel. Clothing solved one problem and, almost immediately, opened a door to another. That pattern should start to sound familiar because you're about to see it again. And once tailored clothing existed, it didn't just help people survive winters they already lived through. It let them go places no unclothed human ever could. Ice Age Siberia was one of the harshest environments on the planet, and yet humans pushed further into it, following herds of mammoth and reindeer across ground so cold that exposed some of those same groups crossed a strip of land connecting Siberia to Alaska, a land bridge scientists call Beringia, walking into a continent that had never seen a human being before. None of that happens with a loose hide flapping open at the collar. It happens because someone, generations earlier, figured out how to sew a second skin tight enough to trap warmth and temperatures that should have killed them. A bone needle didn't just keep people alive. It helped populate an entire hemisphere. You don't have thick fur. You don't have a body built for freezing wind. And somehow you're reading this in a heated room, or scrolling on your phone wearing a jacket, completely unbothered by weather that would have killed your ancestors within a matter of hours. Nothing about your actual body changed to make that possible. What changed is that somewhere back in that ice age, a human figured out how to build a second skin, one they could take off, adjust, or hand down to someone else. And once you start seeing clothing that way, as invented skin rather than just fabric, a lot of strange modern behavior starts making a different kind of sense. Think about how much time you actually spend thinking about what you're wearing. Not just for warmth, obviously, for how you'll be seen, whether it fits the room you're about to walk into, whether it says something true about who you are, or quietly covers up something you'd rather people not notice. You probably stood in front of a closet full of clothes and still felt like you had nothing to wear. That feeling was never really about fabric. It's about whether your second skin matches the version of you. Sewing hides together were solving a survival problem, plain and simple. They had exactly one thing to figure out: stay warm enough to live until spring. You are still using the exact same tool, except now it's mostly solving a social one. And the problem has multiplied into something much messier. The average person today owns more clothing than any human in history has ever owned at one time. And yet, I have nothing to wear is still one of the most common thoughts people have standing in front of a full closet. That's not a supply problem. Your ancestors solved supply 50,000 years ago. What you're dealing with now is a different kind of cold entirely, a low-grade, constant pressure to get the signal right, to make sure the second skin says the correct thing to the correct room every single day. Same technology, same instinct, just aimed at a threat that never fully goes away like weather does. The cold you're bundling up against now is the real shift worth sitting with. Clothing started as armor against the environment. Somewhere along the way, without anyone deciding it on purpose, it also became armor for identity. You use it to say I belong here, or I don't care what you think, or take me seriously. None of that is shallow or silly. It's the same 50,000-year-old instinct, just aimed at a different kind of exposure than the one your ancestors were dealing with in that Siberian cave. So the next time you're staring at that jacket you never wear, or picking an outfit for something that actually matters to you, it's worth remembering what you're doing underneath the decision. You're not just choosing fabric. You're doing the same thing a human did 50,000 years ago with a bone needle and a strip of sinew, stitching together a layer between your exposed self and a world that was never built to fit you exactly as you are. They built it to survive the cold. You're still building it. You just call it closet.